False ideas can be quite dangerous. In addition to the harmful externalities that following false ideas can have, they can also give rise to violence, terrible atrocities, or general instability that leads to such atrocities. Equality, as I have demonstrated in my previous two videos, is a completely false idea in both its factual and normative forms. Here I will argue that the falsity of this idea is not just of intellectual interest, but rather that it has negative political consequences that put into question how benign its exponents really are. As the saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The most obvious example of equality resulting in bloodshed is the twin liberal revolutions, namely the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Both rose out of a desire by the masses and the bourgeoisie to liberate themselves from what they saw to be oppressive monarchical governments, which rendered men politically unequal. In the American case, war was wholly unnecessary, and thus the violence that it caused, pitting brother against brother, was unjustified. In the Declaration of Independence, most of the grievances listed against the crown consist of a desire to be politically independent from George III's power. In other words, their grievance against the monarchy was that it was, well, a monarchy. Monarchs exercise power over regions when it is deemed necessary for the stability and security of the empire, and I think everyone would admit that even federated states have need of the ability to put limits on federation under certain circumstances. To declare that people in the colonies have some sort of absolute entitlement to representation is basically just ideological. In other words, it stems from the liberal conception that men ought to govern themselves rather than to be governed. In fact, the vast majority of the listed grievances in the Declaration are just this: the claim that the righteous authority of the people has been usurped by the crown, something that can be questioned since under monarchy, the people are not absolutely entitled to this authority. In other words, the monarchy is not self-rule. One might offer the English Bill of Rights as proof that the crown was indeed acting beyond its authority and tyrannizing the colonists, and that they had a right to representation, but this argument does not consider the grounds on which the revolutionaries were acting. In other words, they were operating from a radically liberal position in which the right to self-government was inalienable, not just a right prescribed under the crown. And ultimately, the king is the sovereign. He may lose some degree of legitimacy if he violates law, but that law is fundamentally an extension of his sovereignty. It is well within his purview to determine his own actions. Moreover, we have to consider that the actual acts which were the origin of colonist discontent, such as the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, and the Townshend Acts, were actually parliamentary acts, and so did not whatsoever violate the rights of the colonists, nor constitute a violation of the law by George III. This discontent and rebellion, which necessitated emergency actions by the king, the so-called intolerable acts, were never legitimate objects of resistance anyway. We can make the argument whether the liberal point of view is just or not. I don't think that it is, and so I have a personal bias in favor of the crown, but that's beside the point. I'm simply arguing that the colonists were not so put upon that it was absolutely necessary that they should wage a rebellion. The most pressing issue for the rebels was simply that they were being taxed without representation, as if burdensome taxation justifies bloodshed and uprising. Tax burden was the reason for the Boston Tea Party in 1773, where insurrectionaries dressed up as natives and dumped shipments of tea overboard. If something like this were done today, it would have zero political legitimacy and would widely be viewed as unjust and insurrectionary. I think all of us, other than libertarians, can admit that the Boston Tea Party was a huge overreaction. The only reason they committed the act was because the Parliament had passed the Tea Act, which allowed the East India Company to sell Chinese tea to the colonies without being taxed. That's it. I really don't think that that's such a tyrannical thing. As we all learn in American history classroom, the main catalysts for the revolution were the so-called intolerable acts. These acts were really not all that intolerable. The first was the Boston Port Act, which was instituted after the Boston Tea Party. The Crown felt as though the activities of these insurrectionaries had rendered commerce impossible, and so they blockaded the port until Massachusetts was able to come up with restitution to the East India Company for the losses. I think this is a perfectly reasonable course of action, even if it might not have been the smartest in hindsight. If members of a colony are hurting the Crown's commerce, then it makes sense to punish them and demand restitution. Sure, we can argue that punishing the colony as a whole is bound to stir up more anger against the crown rather than to diffuse the situation. And we might also note that the crown vastly overestimated the extent of the rebelliousness of the colonists. But simultaneously, this anger is wildly out of proportion to the actual injury caused by the Tea Act. What we are looking at is basically just liberal extremists, the so-called Sons of Liberty, provoking political instability for their own false ideological interests. I hardly have sympathy for them. The other acts, barring one, were similarly nothing burgers. The Massachusetts Government Act replaced the elected council of the colony with crown-appointed ones. I've already said that the idea that people ought to be completely self-governed is just an inflict of liberal ideology, and as such we could argue whether this is a genuine injury to the people at all. Opponents of the crown have the burden of showing how crown-appointed representatives are actually engaging in deep acts of tyranny versus elected representatives. As Alain de Benoit has argued, even the concept of democratic representation tends to lead, eventually, to neglect of the people's will, and so it's not as though one or the other form of representation is any more democratic. Perhaps the singular bad part of this act is that it allowed sheriffs to appoint jurors, but this act was basically an emergency act. Even liberals accept that democratic countries need emergency powers and the ability to override aspects of the judicial system during a crisis. The worst we could say about the crown is that they misidentified the actual state of the political situation in the colonies, overestimating their hostility. The actual bad act is the Orwellian named Act for the Impartial Administration of Justice, which eliminated the right to a jury trial. But again, this isn't a right guaranteed by the Magna Carta nor the English Bill of Rights, and this was an emergency act almost akin to Abraham Lincoln suspending habeas corpus during the Civil War. In hindsight, it was a terrible decision, but probably not worth starting a bloody war over, since it would have been repealed once the crown believed that the situation had stabilized. One act that is most often cited as the most irritable for the colonists is the Quartering Act. All it did was authorize high-ranking officers to demand better accommodations for troops, to quarter them in inconvenient places, and to occupy uninhabited buildings. We are for some reason taught that this act allowed the crown to quarter troops inside of people's houses, but this isn't actually true. Thus, the picture that we are given that the crown was taking over people's houses in which they were actually living with troops is actually a complete lie. Lastly, we have the Quebec Act. What was so intolerable about it? It extended the borders of Quebec, authorized the Catholic Church inside of Quebec, and allowed French civil law to govern within the territory. The worst thing about it is that it allowed, again, the crown to appoint representatives, but as we have already stated, this isn't really all that much of a grievance. The only reason it is intolerable is because the Anglos really hated Catholics. As we can see, the war was really, really necessary. Finally, I have to mention the so-called Boston Massacre. The background is that British soldiers were stationed in Boston due to rising tensions over the Townshend Acts, which were literally just tariffs instituted by the Parliament. The incident started in 1770 when a physical altercation between a debtor and a British soldier, which was started by the debtor, ended with the soldier smacking the debtor with the butt of his musket. A crowd, led by the opponents of the crown, formed around the customs house, and other soldiers, led by an officer named Preston, arrived. The crowd eventually began hurling rocks and other objects at them. One soldier, fearing for his life, panicked and fired, causing the other soldiers to fire as well. Ultimately, there were only 11 casualties out of a crowd of about 300 or 400. So much for a massacre, and even then, if we were to declare that even one death is too much, we have to consider that the soldiers' actions are actually quite justified, since the crowd was endangering their lives by throwing rocks at them. Since British soldiers didn't exactly have riot gear and tear gas, what else were they supposed to do? Allow themselves to be stoned to death? After the event, the media began reporting on the story. Some reporting was more objective than others. In fact, much of the reporting was driven by patriots who had a vested interest in distorting the situation in order to arouse anger and resentment against the crown. For example, one engraver named Henry Pelham, who was responsible for one of the most widely circulated pictures, depicted Preston ordering the troops to fire, which was of course untrue. The Boston Gazette claimed that the soldiers were an attempt to quell the spirit of liberty. Also, anonymous pamphlets were distributed with a fabricated version of events, declaring that the attacks were quote-unquote unprovoked. It was, according to Neil Langley York, the most influential description of the event, The name the Boston Massacre probably comes from the Patriots themselves, who used the event as propaganda to inflame the colonists against the crown, calling it a massacre. In contrast, the event was impersonally referred to as the incident on King Street in Britain. In the end, it was blown completely out of proportion by the Patriots and was largely the result of their having spread discontent against the British occupation in the first place, which in and of itself was the result of revolutionary agitation in the colonies due to protests against legitimate parliamentary acts. I can see in this no legitimate cause for war, and yet it is widely considered to be the spark that lit the powder keg. John Adams stated that this event constituted the foundation of American independence. Of course, I can't say that the American Revolution isn't completely understandable. Living under burdensome taxation, complicated and unfair commercial laws, and having your regional autonomy violated are quite vexatious things, and we can even argue that the British practice of impressment was genuinely tyrannical and unjust, although Britain had been doing this since at least the 16th century, so it's not as though this were a uniquely colonial problem. It was also completely legal, and at any rate, the practice was abolished in 1780, partly because it had come under criticism by people in Britain itself. It was already on its way out, and so this is yet another reason why the revolution was unnecessary. The fundamental question is whether the revolution was indeed necessary, or even proportionate to the problems that were caused by the crown. I don't think it was at all. What mainly motivated the revolution was simply the desire for emancipation under the liberal idea that men are born politically equal and thus ought to be politically equal. If all men are equal, then to accept subjection to a hereditary crown is a violation of our quote-unquote inalienable rights, as they say. That is the reason why taxation without representation is even a real grievance at all, because those who are taxed are not equal to those who are taxing. Of course, if those who tax us are politically equal to us, then I guess that means burdensome and unfair taxation is perfectly legitimate. So much for emancipation. And of course, the violence of the French Revolution and the subsequent Reign of Terror is well known and barely needs elaboration. The revolutionaries killed farmers and craftsmen, not just nobles. During the Reign of Terror, 16,594 people were given death sentences, and it's probable that many more were unofficially executed. The Reign of Terror was basically proof of the fallacy of the revolutionary, which is that revolutionaries don't aim for equality, but instead they simply become the new oppressors. The newly minted republic declared that all who resisted its arbitrary justice were tyrants opposed to liberty. All who opposed the government of quote-unquote equals were declared, after all, to be subhuman. To illustrate the danger of equality further, part of the cause of the Reign of Terror were demands by the poor to resist violently any who opposed policies that benefited the poor. So in other words, part of the motive for this violence was the attainment of economic equality. We can see basically the same motivation in the Russian Revolution, the consequences of which we are all familiar with, such as millions of people dead, although we can debate on exactly whether the more outlandish numbers are true. Forced collectivization meant to end the supposedly exploitative actions of the so-called kulaks, and as such to create a condition of absolute worker equality, resulted in millions dead. One can object that to pin all of the Soviet Union's deaths on the principle of equality is inappropriate because, 1, Marx never conceived of an equal society, and 2, because the Soviet Union was anything but egalitarian, but I don't think this is really a sound rebuttal. The whole purpose of collectivization is to destroy a hierarchy, and so in other words, it is a result of the moral proposition of social equality. Even the policy of Russification can be conceived of in terms of equality, since it was basically an attempt to make Ukrainians identical to Russians as their cultural differences were making integration troublesome. Ultimately, this is where the principle of equality leads to. People have natural differences, and they are evidently unequal. The only way to promote equality is to eliminate the differences between people. That's why this false idea is so dangerous. Lastly, we will briefly consider the American Civil War. The catalyst for the war was the election of Abraham Lincoln, who was known to be a fierce proponent of the emancipation of slaves. The Southern states, who felt that the institution of slavery was threatened, decided to secede shortly after his election. In anticipation of violent reprisal, they attacked Fort Sumner. Now, I obviously will not defend slavery. I believe that it is a completely pointless institution that, for the most part, doesn't actually even generate that much economic value anyway. Even further, I genuinely think that people ought to have a certain degree of autonomy under their government, And I think that the enslavement of Black people was a great injustice against them and an insult to them as persons. Besides, the emancipation of slaves was unnecessary simply because it was on its way out due to the economic precarity of the South's agrarian economy anyway. But the overall point I'm making is that the moral crusade on the part of Lincoln and the northern states to prepare for violence against those who offended its values of equality ultimately is proof that equality is not an ideology of peace. The same logic behind Lincoln's crusade is the same logic of the modern neoliberal warhawk state, which goes to war against countries for lacking quote-unquote human rights. In other words, the principle of equality can just as much be a motivation for war, even the oppression of others, such as those in the third world, as any system based on the notion of inequality. Basically, what I'm saying is that Lincoln has just as much blood on his hands as the Confederacy. Around 1 million people were dead by the end of the Civil War, including 50,000 civilians. All this bloodshed was over the question of equality, and since again slavery was already dying out, it was completely unnecessary. And it's proof that men will throw scores of lives away for this abstract and false value. Moreover, we must understand the actual telos of equality, the leveling of differences. That is why equality has so often motivated violence. The ultimate end of the ideal of equality is thus world domination, the fusion of all peoples and nations into a homogeneous collective under a single government. The violence that would be required to accomplish this is unimaginable in scope, and the oppression it would result in is terrifying to conceive. The Soviet Union constituted this, but on a smaller scale. Only when all differences eliminated and all natural inequalities suppressed or violently engineered out of us can we possibly conceive of humans as equals to one another. Because equality is factually false, it would be necessary to force us to be equal. It would require the repression of all those who are individually better in some way than other people, be it in intelligence, virtue, or character. It would require the elimination of unique cultures, of unique races, even of unique people. The dream of equality, such that we might find in John Lennon's Imagine, must confront its dark underside, mass conformity, and the dystopia of equality. Another reason the doctrine of equality causes violence is because, as Thomas Hobbes states in The Leviathan, if people believe they are equal, then they believe that they have an equal chance at acquiring what the other has. This is the logic behind all rebellions toward equality. Our enemy is equal to us, but he oppresses us. We are just as likely to be able to use violence against him since we are equal to him, and because we are equal, our subjection is unjust. This is why the American revolutionaries fought against the crown. This is why the French revolutionaries fought against the Ancien regime. This is why the Red Army fought against the imperial state. If all are equal, then no authority but our own is legitimate. And what happens if we instantiate a new authority? Well, that must be illegitimate too, and we have a good chance at winning because they are fundamentally equal to us. You understand, equality is just the war of all against all. Either that, or ultimately, it's the final melting of humanity into the grey goo by the action of global power, in the interest of preventing the war of all against all. It's no wonder that equality inspires violence, and for that reason, we ought to reject it in the interest of making peace with our inequalities and hierarchies. The reality is that inequality is actually diversity and freedom.